He thought she was just another customer in a beat-up old Ford. Grease on his hands, debt on his shoulders, a 5-year-old daughter asleep in the office cot. Dan Carter had no idea that the woman in the white suit hiding millions under her calm smile was about to set his entire world on fire. Cleveland was heavy, with mist that morning, the kind that clung to the cracked asphalt and carried the smell of damp iron from the old rail tracks nearby. The little corner garage, Carter Auto, looked like it had been standing since the 50s, its sign half faded, the windows clouded with grease and dust. Inside, Daniel Carter leaned over the hood of a Chevy, sweat running down his temple, his hands stained with oil that no soap seemed able to scrub away anymore. He was 31, a man who carried both weariness and stubborn resilience in the lines of his face. Behind him, on a makeshift table, his daughter Lily sat with a box of crayons, humming while she drew. At 5 years old, she had already learned to make the most of long hours spent in the garage, waiting for her father. The growl of an engine outside caught Dan's attention. He wiped his hands on an old rag and stepped out into the cool air, just as a faded Ford Taurus rolled slowly through the open gate. The car looked like it had seen better days. Dull paint, dents that someone hadn't bothered to fix, and the uneven rattle of brakes that had been neglected far too long. But what drew his eyes wasn't the car. It was the woman stepping out of it. She was dressed in a white suit, immaculate against the gray backdrop of the neighborhood. Her blonde hair was swept neatly into a bun, and her eyes, warm brown and surprisingly steady, swept over the garage sign as though she were assessing not just a building, but the man inside it. For a moment, she seemed almost out of place here, like she had walked off the cover of a magazine into a world of grease and rust. But there was no arrogance in the way she stood, only quiet composure. "Welcome," Dan said, his voice rough but not unkind. He tossed the rag onto the bench and walked closer. "What seems to be the problem?" The woman adjusted the strap of her bag, her tone calm and businesslike. "It squeaks. Sometimes it stalls at lights. And the brakes don't feel right. They catch and then let go suddenly. I thought it was safer to bring it in before something happens. I'm Avery." Dan nodded, already cataloging her words in his mind. Brakes that catch and release. That could mean anything from worn pads to a dangerous leak. "All right, Avery, let me take a look. Pull it into Bay 2. She drove forward and parked. Dan slid under the hood with practiced movements, tools in hand, and within minutes saw what she hadn't. Brake pads ground almost to nothing, one of the lines dangerously loose, as though the fitting had been left half-turned after a rush job. His jaw tightened. Too many times he'd seen cars come in after being overcharged elsewhere, patched up just enough to roll back out with new problems waiting. He fixed it. Slowly, methodically, because that was the only way he knew. Tightened the fitting, replaced the pads, double-checked every line twice. Avery waited in the corner, arms folded, her gaze moving between him and the open hood. She seemed more curious than impatient, as though she wanted to see how he worked, not just the result. When it was done, he wrote up the order. The price wasn't small, but it was fair, honest. He handed her the paper, expecting the usual sigh or a bargaining attempt. Instead, her brows lifted in surprise. "This is all?" she asked, glancing at the total. "That's the work," he replied, matter of fact. "You pay for what I fixed, not for my imagination." She studied him for a beat, and something flickered across her expression, a mix of intrigue and faint disbelief. Then she gave the slightest nod. Across the room, Lily tugged at her crayons. She had been drawing with fierce concentration, but now she hopped off the chair and toddled over, holding up a sheet of paper. A yellow sun beamed from the top corner, and beside it a stick figure woman in a white suit, her hair in a tight bun. "That's you," Lily said brightly, looking up at Avery with wide, innocent eyes. "You're the lady in white." Avery's composure cracked just a little, her lips curving into a smile warmer than anything she had shown until then. She crouched, taking the paper as though it were something fragile and rare. "Thank you, sweetheart," she murmured. "It's beautiful." Dan watched silently, something tightening in his chest. He had seen customers smile at Lily before, but rarely with this kind of softness. It unsettled him, though he couldn't say why. Maybe because Avery looked so completely out of place here, and yet in that moment she seemed like she belonged. When the paperwork was done, she paid him without complaint, Her hands lingered on the crayon drawing longer than on the receipt. Then she slipped back into her car, the engine humming smoother now. Dan stood in the doorway, rag in hand, watching the white-suited figure disappear into the misty Cleveland streets, leaving behind only the faint smell of her perfume, mixed with oil and metal. He told himself it was just another job, just another car. But something about the way she had looked at him, at Lily, made it feel like the beginning of something he couldn't yet name. 2 days later, the sky was clearer, sunlight bouncing off the cracked glass of the garage windows when the familiar Taurus rolled back into the lot. Dan was halfway through tightening a belt on a pickup when he heard the engine sputter, and he looked up with a faint frown. He hadn't expected to see her again so soon. Avery stepped out of the car, this time dressed simply in jeans and a fitted navy shirt, her hair loose around her shoulders. Gone was the immaculate white suit. Gone was the aura of someone who might be on her way to a boardroom meeting. Yet she still carried herself with a quiet assurance, like she belonged in both worlds, marble offices and greasy workshops alike. She walked over, lifting a brow as she caught his expression. "Before you scold me, I swear I'm not here just to test your patience." The car's making a strange whistling sound. "It started yesterday. I thought it might go away on its own, but—" She gestured with one hand toward the Taurus, lips quirking. "It didn't." Dan set down his wrench and wiped his hands. "A whistle, huh? Could be a cracked hose or a loose belt. Pop the hood." He leaned over the engine while she stood beside him, close enough that he caught the faint scent of her perfume under the garage's more familiar odors of rubber and oil. It took time, longer than he liked, to find the culprit. The whistle wasn't obvious, the sort of problem a less patient mechanic might have shrugged off. But patience was the only way Dan worked. Nearly an hour passed before his fingers traced over a thin hose that had begun to split. A micro crack, invisible unless you knew where to look. "There's your villain," he said finally, straightening and holding the cracked piece up for her to see. "Air leaking here. That's your whistle." She tilted her head, studying the damaged hose with more interest than most clients ever showed. "You really found that tiny thing?" He shrugged. "Car engines are like people. Sometimes the smallest flaws cause the loudest trouble. Give me a few minutes." He replaced the hose quickly, tested the idle, and listened. The whistle was gone. Satisfied, he shut the hood. "You're good to go now." Avery reached into her bag, already pulling out her wallet. "All right, what do I owe you this time?" Dan shook his head, holding up a hand. "Nothing." Her brows lifted. "Nothing?" "It was my oversight," he said firmly. "Should have noticed that hose the first time I had the hood open. I don't charge twice for the same problem." Avery blinked, clearly not used to hearing such words. Most shops would have billed her again without hesitation. For a long moment, she just looked at him, as though weighing his honesty like a coin in her palm. Then slowly, she slipped a bill from her wallet and tried to press it toward him. "At least take this as a tip." He stepped back, shaking his head. "Keep it. I meant what I said. You don't pay for my mistakes." Something flickered across her face then. Not irritation, but something more complicated. Admiration? Amusement? She tucked the money away, and instead let her gaze wander to the corner of the garage, where Lily had been scribbling away with crayons again. The little girl looked up at that exact moment and hopped off her chair, clutching another drawing in both hands. She ran over, grinning. "Miss Avery, I made you another picture." Avery knelt as Lily held out the paper. This time it showed a stick figure version of Avery in jeans, hair flowing, standing next to a smaller stick figure with curly brown hair holding a crayon. Above them, a crooked heart floated in red crayon. "That's you and me," Lily explained seriously, "because you came back." Avery's breath caught in her throat, though she quickly turned it into a warm laugh. "Well, aren't I lucky? 2 pictures already. I'll have to start a collection." She carefully slid the drawing into a leather folder she carried alongside her papers. The logo stamped on the folder, Morgan Mobility, flashed in the light. Dan noticed it, recognized it as one of the big automotive tech firms in the city, but said nothing. He figured it wasn't his place to ask why someone tied to such a company was driving an old Taurus into his tiny garage. When Avery straightened, her eyes lingered on him again. "You know," she said softly, "you're making it very difficult for me to believe you're real. Most people would have doubled the bill by now." Dan gave a small shrug, avoiding the weight of her gaze. "Most people aren't raising a 5-year-old. When it comes to cars, I do my work straight. That's it. There was a pause, a silence filled with the hum of the fluorescent lights and Lily's humming as she went back to her crayons. Then Avery smiled, different from before, gentler, almost personal. Then maybe I came to the right place after all. She thanked him again, her voice quieter this time, before slipping back into her Taurus. Dan stood in the doorway, watching as the car rolled off the lot, running smooth now. No whistles or squeaks. He told himself it was just another repair, another customer. Yet the image of her kneeling to take Lily's drawing, carefully tucking it into that folder like it was priceless, stayed with him long after the sound of the Taurus faded into the streets. The night air hung heavy around the little neighborhood, the kind of silence that never truly felt safe. Dan had stayed late in the garage, finishing up paperwork after Lily had fallen asleep on the cot he kept in the back office. The buzzing of the fluorescent light above him was the only sound until he heard the low rumble of an engine outside. He frowned, setting down his pen. Through the grimy front window, he spotted the silhouette of a matte black pickup parked just beyond the glow of the street lamp. Its lights were off, the engine idling. He waited, trying to convince himself it was just someone turning around, but the truck didn't move. It sat there like a shadow that refused to leave. Dan's jaw clenched. Old instincts told him trouble had a way of showing up quiet before it broke loud. After a few minutes, the pickup finally rolled off, tires crunching slow on the gravel, and disappeared around the corner. He didn't like it. He thought of Vince Tomlin, his former boss, a man who ran a chain of quick-fix garages where honesty was as rare as free labor. Vince had never forgiven him for walking out years ago after refusing to lie to customers. Worse, Dan had opened his own shop, and though small, Carter Auto had started stealing Vince's business, one loyal client at a time. He knew Vince's pride. He knew what the man was capable of when money was at stake. The memory left a sour taste in his mouth as he turned off the lights and carried Lily home. The next morning, the Taurus was back. Avery drove in with a furrow between her brows, the car rolling uneasy across the lot. "I don't know what's happening," she said as she stepped out. "The brakes feel off again, sluggish. Then suddenly they catch. It scared me on the highway." Dan's chest tightened. He wasted no time, pulling the car into the bay. The moment he crouched under the hood, his stomach dropped. A faint trail of brake fluid snaked down one of the lines, shining wet in the light. The fitting wasn't loose from wear. It had been tampered with. Someone had jammed a tool into the metal, forcing it open just enough to leak. His pulse quickened, anger rising hot under his skin. This wasn't neglect. It was deliberate. He photographed the damage, every angle, every telltale mark of sabotage. His hands moved fast, trained and precise, tightening the line, replacing what needed replacing, making sure the car would be safe. When he straightened, grease streaked across his cheek. Avery was watching him from the corner with an unreadable expression. "Talk to me," she said, voice steady but lower than usual. Dan wiped his hands, met her eyes, and didn't soften the truth. "Someone messed with your brakes. This wasn't wear and tear. It was intentional. If you'd driven much longer, you could have lost them entirely." For the first time since he'd met her, Avery's composure cracked. Her lips parted, breath catching in disbelief. "You mean someone wanted me to crash?" He handed her the printed report, his handwriting scrawled across the page. "This is everything I found. Keep it. If anything happens, this will prove what was done." His voice hardened, his eyes dark. "Don't take this lightly, Avery. Whoever did this didn't care if you lived or died." She stared at the paper, then at him, and something shifted in her gaze. The polished calm she usually wore gave way to something raw, more vulnerable. "And you? Why go this far? Most mechanics would have just fixed it and handed me a bill." "Because honesty isn't just about fair prices," he said, his voice low but fierce. "It's about telling people when their lives are on the line." Silence stretched between them, heavy but charged. Lily, oblivious, giggled from the corner, coloring another page. The innocent sound cut through the tension, grounding them both. Avery's hands trembled as she folded the report and slipped it into her folder alongside Lily's drawings. She met Dan's eyes once more, and her voice softened almost to a whisper. "Thank you. You didn't just fix my car today. You might have saved my life." Dan wanted to tell her it was nothing, that it was his job, but the words stuck. Because looking at her, shaken yet still standing tall, he realized this wasn't just another client anymore. Something larger was unfolding. something that pulled both of them into a story neither had expected. That night, long after Avery's car had driven away and the shop was dark again, Dan stood in the silence of the garage. His fists clenched as the memory of the matte black pickup returned. He no longer had doubts. Trouble wasn't circling. It had already arrived. Dan had been expecting her to show up again, but not like this. The call had come early in the morning. Avery's voice clipped but warm, asking if he could meet her downtown for what she called a special diagnostic. She didn't sound nervous, but something in her tone suggested it wasn't about the car. Against his better judgment, he said yes. By late afternoon, he was guiding his dented old Chevy pickup into a gleaming parking structure that didn't belong to his world. Glass towers rose above him, steel and light slicing the sky. Lily sat in the passenger seat, swinging her legs and pressing her nose to the window, wide-eyed at the skyscrapers. Dan felt out of place instantly, his boots leaving dusty prints on the pristine concrete floor as they stepped out. He held Lily's small hand firmly, his calloused fingers dwarfing hers, as if grounding himself in the one thing that still felt real. They approached the lobby of a high-rise where security guards in tailored suits eyed him with the cool detachment of men who judge worth in shoes and watches. Avery appeared in the middle of the lobby before he could speak, striding toward them with the same quiet composure she had carried into his shop the first day. She wore another immaculate white suit, her hair pinned back flawlessly, a figure who seemed carved for this setting. Yet when she looked at Lily, her expression softened, and she knelt briefly to greet the little girl before straightening again. "This way," Avery said, her voice smooth, professional, but tinged with something more personal when her eyes flicked to Dan. The elevator ride was silent except for Lily humming. The numbers ticked upward, 20, 30, 40, before the doors opened on the top floor. The space beyond was nothing like the grease-stained garage Dan knew. Polished marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the skyline, catching the last of the day's light. A vast conference room opened in front of them, dominated by a sleek table of glass and chrome. And on the far wall, lit proudly, was the logo, Morgan Mobility. Dan froze, every nerve on edge. His hand tightened around Lily's. "You work here?" he asked slowly, suspicion sharpening the edge of his voice. Avery exhaled softly as if bracing herself. She removed her blazer, laying it carefully on the table, and faced him without flinching. "I don't just work here, Dan. I run it." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm the CEO of Morgan Mobility. And yes, I'm a millionaire." For a second, the world tilted. Dan's mouth went dry, disbelief sparking into something hotter, anger. He let out a low laugh, but there was no humor in it. "So what was I, huh? Just some test run? The poor mechanic you parade around to see if he passes the honesty exam?" Her gaze held his, unwavering, though her voice dropped into something more raw than he'd heard before. "I was looking for someone I could trust, someone who wouldn't bend when it mattered. I've built a company that's supposed to make cars safer, smarter, but you know what the industry's like. Corners cut, lies told, lives risked. I needed to know if there was someone out there who would stand against all that, even when no one was watching." His jaw worked, fists clenching at his sides. "So you sabotaged your own car? Put yourself on the road with bad brakes, just to see if I'd notice?" Her shoulders straightened, but her eyes softened. "I had people who could protect me, but I needed to know if you were real, and you are. You found what others would have ignored. You didn't take advantage. You told me the truth, even when it cost you. That's rarer than any amount of money I have." The silence stretched, thick enough to choke on. Dan felt heat rising in his chest. Part fury, part something else. Confusion, a reluctant admiration he didn't want to admit. He wanted to tell her she had no right, that she'd used him like a pawn in some game of corporate trust building. Yet when he looked at her, standing there stripped of pretense, admitting her wealth and power without apology, he realized she wasn't playing. She was bearing something vulnerable, dangerous for a woman in her position to reveal. Before he could speak, a small voice cut through the tension. Lily tugged on Avery's sleeve and held up another crayon drawing she'd been clutching since the elevator ride. This one showed three stick figures: a tall man with black hair, a woman in a white suit, and a little girl in the middle holding both their hands. Above them floated another crooked heart. "You're in white again," Lily said with a grin. "Pretty?" Avery knelt down, her eyes misting just slightly as she accepted the paper with trembling fingers. "Thank you, Lily," she whispered, her composure breaking for just a moment. Dan watched the scene, something in him shifting against his will. He still felt betrayed, blindsided, but the sight of his daughter laughing with this woman, this CEO, this millionaire who didn't act like one when she looked at Lily, unraveled the anger just enough to let doubt creep in. Maybe Avery Morgan wasn't just a millionaire playing games. Maybe she was someone who had been searching for honesty as desperately as he had been clinging to it. And that terrified him even more. The night the fire came was one of those damp Cleveland nights where the air clung to your skin and carried the faint metallic tang of rain that never quite fell. Dan had stayed late again. Lily curled up in the office cot under a thin blanket, her little chest rising and falling with the soft rhythm of dreams. The garage was quiet except for the ticking of cooling engines and the scratch of his pen as he filled out invoices under the harsh fluorescent lights. He was exhausted, but there was a peace in these moments. The silence after the work was done, the knowledge that his hands had earned just enough to get them through another week. Then the peace cracked. It started with a noise outside, dull, almost like glass tapping against glass. He frowned, set down the pen, and rose. Before he reached the door, the smell hit him. Acrid, chemical, wrong. The next sound was a muffled whoomp, and suddenly orange light bled through the gaps around the garage door. Dan's blood froze. "Lily!" His voice was already hoarse. He sprinted to the office, scooped her up, still half asleep, confused, and bolted out the back exit. The second door burst open just as flames licked across the wall of tool cabinets, swallowing years of work in a hungry roar. Outside, the night was alive with smoke and sparks. He stumbled into the alley, clutching Lily against his chest, her small fist clinging to his shirt. "Daddy?" she whimpered, still drowsy, her voice trembling. "I've got you, baby. I've got you." Neighbors shouted, some running with hoses, others calling 911. Dan stood a few yards away, his heart pounding as he watched his garage, his livelihood, his second home, his legacy, become an inferno. The old beams cracked and snapped, flames leaping higher, painting the sky with terror. Someone tried to drag him back as he surged forward, but he tore free long enough to dive into the office again. He came out coughing, choking, clutching a cardboard box filled with Lily's drawings, a few photos, and the folder of reports he had written up for Avery about her sabotaged brakes. It wasn't much. Everything else, the tools, the lifts, the grease-stained manuals, the old frame picture of his father teaching him to fix an engine, was gone. By the time the fire trucks arrived, half the building was nothing but a black skeleton. Water hissed and steamed, smoke billowed, and Dan stood on the curb barefoot, his shirt singed at the sleeves, Lily in his arms, watching everything he'd built collapse in front of him. He didn't cry. He couldn't. The fury burned hotter than the flames. He knew in the marrow of his bones this wasn't an accident. He thought of the black pickup idling outside nights before, of Vince Tomlin's sneer, of the deliberate sabotage on Avery's car. The pattern was too clear. The next morning, the ruins smoldered quietly. Dan sat on the curb, his daughter asleep against his side, soot streaking her cheek. He was hollow, the kind of tired that weighed on the soul more than the body. When the sound of heels clicking against pavement reached his ears, he didn't even lift his head at first. But then a familiar voice spoke his name. "Dan." He looked up. Avery stood at the edge of the wreckage, not in her perfect white suit, but in jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot, her face stripped of polish. She looked less like a CEO and more like a woman who belonged to this broken street. Yet the calm in her eyes remained, though now it carried something heavier. Guilt. "This is on me," she said quietly. Dan's jaw tightened. "Number?" This was Vince. Her gaze swept over the blackened beams, the melted tools, the smoke-stained brick. "Maybe, but it happened because of me. Someone wanted to send a message, and they used you to do it." He rose slowly, brushing ash from his jeans. "That bastard has hated me for years. He's been waiting for a reason. You just gave him one." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Then let me help. I brought insurance adjusters, investigators, engineers. We'll find proof." We'll nail him for this. He almost laughed, bitter and sharp. What are you going to do? Buy me a new garage with your millions? I don't need charity. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. This isn't charity. This is justice. We have surveillance footage of that pickup. We have your reports. And I have a legal team that Vince can't buy off. This isn't about pity, Dan. It's about fighting back. Something in her tone cut through the fog of rage. She wasn't offering him a handout. She was drawing up a battle plan. She spoke like a general, like a woman used to walking into war armed with numbers and lawyers instead of rifles. And somehow in that moment, Dan saw her differently. Not as a millionaire in disguise, not as a customer, or even as the woman who had tested him, but as an ally standing in the ashes of his life, refusing to look away. Lily stirred, rubbing her eyes, her voice groggy. Daddy, is the garage gone? Dan crouched, holding her tight, fighting the lump in his throat. Yeah, baby, but we're still here. That's what matters. Avery knelt beside them, her eyes softening as she reached out to brush soot from Lily's cheek. And we'll make sure whoever did this pays. You're not alone in this, Dan. Not anymore. For the first time since the flames consumed everything he had built, Dan felt a spark that wasn't anger or despair. It was something smaller but steadier. Hope. Fragile, but alive. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and coffee left too long on hot plates. Dan had never stepped foot inside one before, not for anything more serious than a traffic ticket, but now he found himself seated at the plaintiff's table, his calloused hands folded too tightly on his knees. He felt out of place in his best shirt, a plain blue button-down that still smelled faintly of smoke no matter how many times he washed it. Next to him, Avery looked like she belonged in this world, her posture straight, her expression controlled, her eyes sharp. But she wasn't dressed like the powerful CEO he had seen at Morgan Mobility. She'd chosen something simpler, almost deliberately understated. A dark blazer, minimal jewelry, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. She wasn't there to impress. She was there to win. Across the room sat Vince Tomlin. He had the same wolfish grin Dan remembered from the old days, the kind of smirk that said he was certain the world bent to money. He leaned back in his chair as though the courtroom were his living room, his expensive lawyer whispering in his ear. Behind him sat two of his shop managers, men Dan had once worked alongside, men who'd laughed when Dan refused to fake repair reports. Their presence made Dan's stomach knot tighter. The judge entered, the bailiff called the room to order, and the proceedings began. Avery's legal team was fast, efficient, and merciless. They laid out the evidence step by step, the surveillance footage showing the matte black pickup idling near Dan's garage minutes before the fire broke out, the photographs Dan had taken of the sabotage brake line on Avery's car, the financial records showing Vince's shops charging clients for unnecessary repairs. Every piece landed like a hammer strike. Dan had to testify. He walked to the stand, swearing in with a dry throat. When he spoke, his voice was rough at first, but steadier as he went on. He told the court about the years he had worked for Vince, about the orders he'd been pressured to falsify, about the customers cheated and endangered. He told them why he left, why he opened his own place. And finally, he described the night of the fire, the smell of accelerant, the way the pickup truck had lurked before disappearing. Do you have any doubt, Avery's lawyer asked him, that Vince Tomlin orchestrated this? Dan looked straight at Vince, at that smug grin, and felt his jaw tighten. Not a single doubt. Vince's attorney tried to break him on cross-examination, painting him as a bitter ex-employee, a failed businessman looking to blame his misfortune on someone more successful. But every time they pressed, Avery's team had an answer, another document, another witness. One by one, former customers came forward, each with a story about being cheated by Tomlin's chain. One man choked up as he described how his wife's brakes failed weeks after Vince's shop supposedly fixed them, causing an accident that left her in physical therapy for months. The turning point came when an internal auditor from Morgan Mobility presented her findings. Avery had sent her team into Vince's shops undercover. They came back with damning proof. Counterfeit parts labeled as premium, service reports copied and pasted with fake diagnoses, safety inspections marked complete without ever being performed. The judge leaned forward in his seat, brows furrowed deeper with every page. When it was Vince's turn to testify, his arrogance finally cracked. At first he sneered, denying everything, calling the fire an unfortunate accident and the sabotage fabricated nonsense. But under the weight of evidence, his tone shifted, sweat beaded on his forehead. Then in a moment that sent a shock through the courtroom, he snapped. "Fine," Vince shouted, slamming a hand against the table. "Yes, I sent someone to scare her. She stuck her nose where it didn't belong. She and this saintly mechanic of hers think they can ruin me? I wanted them shaken up, that's all. The brakes, the fire, none of it was supposed to go that far." The room erupted, gasps, murmurs, the judge's gavel hammering for silence. Avery didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still, eyes locked on Vince, her expression unreadable except for the faintest tightening around her mouth. Vince realized too late what he'd done. His lawyer tried to salvage it, stammering about stress, about words taken out of context, but the damage was irreversible. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Avery rose when given the chance to speak. Her voice carried through the room clear and steady. "This is what happens when greed outweighs integrity, when lives are reduced to numbers on a page. Mr. Tomlin endangered not just me, but every person who trusted his shops. If not for Mr. Carter's honesty, I might not be standing here at all. We ask this court to see that integrity is not weakness. It's the only thing that keeps people safe." Dan felt something inside him shift as he watched her. He had come here with anger burning in his chest, but now he saw something else. This wasn't just about revenge or money. It was about proving that truth still mattered in a world where lies seemed easier. The judge recessed for deliberation, but everyone in the room knew how it would end. Vince sat slumped, his bravado gone, while Dan returned to his seat beside Avery. For the first time since the fire, he allowed himself to breathe. Avery leaned slightly toward him, not enough for anyone else to notice, and whispered, "We're winning, Dan. Not just here, out there too." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, at the steadiness in her brown eyes, and realized that for all her wealth and power, she wasn't untouchable. She had risked everything to fight this battle, and she had chosen to fight it beside him. That truth was heavier than any verdict. When the judge finally returned and delivered his ruling, holding Vince Tomlin liable for arson, sabotage, and fraud, Dan felt the weight lift from his shoulders. The court had listened. Justice, for once, had been louder than money. And yet, as they walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, Dan knew the real battle was only beginning. His garage was still gone. His life was still in pieces. But Avery was there, steady at his side, her hand brushing close enough to his that he almost reached for it. Almost. Because even as relief washed over him, a new fear crept in. Not of Vince, not of fire, but of what it meant to let this woman, a CEO, a millionaire, a world so far above his own, step closer into his life. Dan had always believed in two things: hard work and keeping your dignity intact. The fire had taken his shop, stripped away the tools and machines he had collected over a lifetime, but he had held on to the only thing that mattered: his integrity. Now sitting at the small kitchen table in his apartment, staring at the pile of documents Avery had left with him, he felt that very integrity being tested in ways he hadn't expected. The papers outlined her proposal: a partnership, an investment, a chance to rebuild not just Carter Auto, but something much bigger. She called it Lily Garage, named after his daughter. A network of service centers that would operate with full transparency, free brake inspections, honest pricing, programs to support single parents working in the trade. It was ambitious, bold. It sounded like a dream he might have had once, before life wore him down. But dreams carried weight. Dreams had strings attached. He rubbed his temples, the kitchen clock ticking in the background. Lily was on the floor with her dolls, humming as if the world hadn't collapsed around them. Sometimes he envied her innocence, the way she could find light in the ashes. But the weight of decisions was his alone to carry. When Avery came by that evening, she didn't arrive in a white suit or a polished car. She wore a soft gray sweater, her hair down, carrying takeout bags in both hands. The smell of fried chicken filled the small apartment as she set the food on the table without ceremony, like she had done it 100 times before. Lily lit up instantly, chattering about school and crayons, while Avery listened with full attention, laughing in all the right places, tucking Lily's hair behind her ear, as if she'd been part of their lives forever. But when Lily skipped off to her room to play, the atmosphere shifted. Avery turned back to Dan, her eyes serious. "You've read the proposal?" He nodded but didn't meet her gaze. I've read it, and it scares the hell out of me. Her brow furrowed. Why? Because I don't want to be your project, he said, his voice rough. I don't want to wake up one day and realize I sold my soul for shiny tools and a name painted on a sign. I don't want Lily growing up thinking her father made it because a millionaire swooped in to save him. The words hung between them, sharp, harsher than he intended. But Avery didn't recoil. She leaned forward, folding her hands, her tone steady but soft. Dan, this isn't charity. It's a partnership. I'm not asking to own you. I'm asking to build something with you. The garage would be yours, your vision, your leadership. I'd provide resources, that's all. And yes, I have money. I won't apologize for that. But money doesn't fix everything. Integrity does. That's what you bring to the table. That's why I came to you in the first place. He shook his head, frustration boiling. You make it sound so simple, but you don't understand what it's like, living paycheck to paycheck. I've been the man who gets stepped on because he doesn't have the cash to fight back. Taking your help, it feels like admitting I can't stand on my own 2 feet. For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the muffled sound of Lily singing to her dolls in the next room. Then Avery's voice came again, quieter now. Standing alone isn't the same as standing strong. You've done more with less than most people ever will. You've proven who you are 100 times over. Letting someone stand with you doesn't erase that. It just means you're not carrying the weight alone anymore. He finally looked up at her then, at the steadiness in her brown eyes. She wasn't pleading, and she wasn't commanding. She was simply telling the truth, the way he always tried to do. It disarmed him. Still, he hesitated. And if I say yes, what happens then? What if this becomes another corporate empire with my name slapped on the door while I sit in the corner and watch you run it? Avery shook her head. Then we start with one garage. No empire, no strings, just a loan, interest-free. You set the rules, you lead. And if it doesn't work, if you ever feel like you're losing yourself, we stop. Simple as that. Her words were steady, but her eyes betrayed something deeper. Fear, maybe, that he would turn her away, that all the walls she had broken down between them would go back up. Before he could answer, Lily reappeared, clutching a marker-streaked piece of paper. She held it out proudly. On it was a drawing of their little apartment, but this time there was another figure standing with them, a tall woman with yellow hair, holding Lily's hand. Over their heads was a bright red heart. See? Lily said with a grin. Now we're all together. Avery's breath caught. She took the drawing carefully, her hand trembling slightly, and looked at Dan. There was no pretense in her eyes now, no CEO steel, no millionaire polish, just a woman hoping she belonged. Dan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wanted to resist, to cling to the safety of his independence, but Lily's innocent certainty made his fears feel small. He exhaled, long and heavy. One garage, he said finally, his voice low. On my terms. Avery's lips curved, relief flooding her features, though she kept her answer simple. One garage. On your terms. And for the first time since the fire, Dan felt something shift inside him. Not just hope, but the fragile beginnings of trust. The grand opening of Lily Garage arrived on a crisp morning, the kind of day where the sky was washed clean, and everything felt like it was waiting for something new to begin. The building itself stood where the blackened skeleton of the old garage had once been, but nothing about it looked like ruins anymore. Fresh paint gleamed in soft white and blue. The name Lily Garage was etched proudly above the entrance in bold letters. A small sunflower painted beside it, taken from one of Lily's drawings. Inside, the air smelled faintly of new rubber and fresh wood, not smoke. Dan stood just inside the doorway, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his cleanest work jeans, trying to look composed but feeling every pair of eyes on him. The shop was full of neighbors, curious drivers, and even reporters. People who had heard about the court case, about the fire, about the fight he and Avery had waged. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. He was a man who lived in grease and wrenches, not speeches and cameras. His throat tightened as he glanced around at the displays Avery had insisted on. The big wall of transparent price lists, the corner filled with toys and books for kids who had to wait, the glass case holding 2 items he hadn't known she'd saved, the crayon drawing Lily had given Avery that first day, and the report he had written up when he discovered her brake line had been sabotaged. When he saw them framed side by side, he nearly lost his composure. That wasn't just business. That was his life, his daughter, his truth. Then the sound of the Taurus's familiar engine rolled across the lot. Dan's head snapped up. Through the crowd, the car eased forward, polished now to a shine, the dents smoothed out. The driver's door opened, and Avery stepped out, dressed in her signature white suit, her hair pinned back neatly. She looked radiant, commanding, and yet there was no boardroom steel in her eyes today. Only warmth, only certainty. She walked through the crowd straight toward him, ignoring the cameras, ignoring the murmurs. Dan's chest tightened. He had thought today was about the garage, about business, about rebuilding, but the look on her face told him it was about something more. She stopped in front of him, then without hesitation, lowered herself down to one knee. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but she didn't seem to notice. She held his gaze, her brown eyes steady, her voice clear enough that everyone could hear, though the words were meant for him alone. Dan Carter, she said, I came into your life pretending to be just another woman with car trouble. You showed me honesty when you didn't know who I was, when you had nothing to gain. You showed me integrity when others would have chosen profit. You protected me even when it put you in danger. And you showed me what it means to build a life worth fighting for. Her voice softened, just enough to crack the steel. I don't want to be the CEO in your world. I want to be Avery, part of your family if you'll let me. Dan felt the ground shift beneath him. His breath caught, his hands trembling in his pockets. He wanted to say something, to answer, but the words tangled in his chest. It wasn't just shock. It was the sheer weight of everything they had been through. The fire, the trial, the nights when he thought he had lost everything. And now here she was, offering not money, not business, but herself. Before he could speak, Lily darted forward, her small hands clutching Avery's arm. Does this mean you'll be my mom? She asked, her voice innocent and bright. Avery's composure broke completely then. She smiled through tears and pulled Lily into her arms. If you'll have me, sweetheart, if both of you will. Dan swallowed hard, his eyes stinging. He pulled them both close, one arm around Avery, the other lifting Lily off the ground. The applause of the crowd faded into the background, meaningless. All he heard was Lily's laughter, Avery's soft breath against his shoulder, and the pounding of his own heart. Later, after the ceremony and the ribbon cutting, after the speeches Avery gave to the press and the handshakes with city officials, Dan found himself standing beside her in the new office. Papers lay on the desk, official documents marking their partnership. He noticed something unusual in the contract. Avery had signed over 51% of the business to him, leaving herself with 49%. The loan she had promised? Forgiven? Her share? A gift? He looked at her stunned. Why would you do this? She met his eyes with quiet certainty. Because this is yours, Dan. It always was. I didn't come here to take. I came here to give. The millions, the title, none of it matters if I can't share it with the people I believe in. He had no words, only the overwhelming urge to kiss her, to hold her, to believe that maybe, after all the fire and loss, he was allowed this kind of happiness. As the sun set outside, casting golden light across the glass walls of Lily Garage, the three of them stepped out into the parking lot together. Avery in her white suit, Dan in his oil-stained boots, and Lily skipping between them, her hands in theirs. For the first time in a long time, the world didn't feel heavy. The future still promised battles, competition, expansion, challenges they couldn't yet see. But for the first time, Dan didn't feel like he was facing it alone. The city around them buzzed, cars honking, engines roaring, but above it all rang the sound of Lily's laughter. It was brighter than the flames that had destroyed his old life. It was steadier than the doubts that had haunted him. It was the sound of a family beginning. And when Avery looked up at him, her eyes shining, he realized he wasn't afraid anymore. My personal take on the ending of this story is that it lands exactly where it needs to. Not in a fantasy of riches magically fixing everything, but in the quieter truth that love, trust, and integrity reshape a life far more than money ever could. Dan doesn't stop being the man with grease-stained hands and a stubborn pride. Avery doesn't stop being the brilliant woman who carries the weight of her company and her fortune. What changes is the choice they both make, to meet in the middle, without masks, without games. The fire stripped Dan's world bare, but it also created the space for something new to grow. Avery's millions could rebuild walls, but only her willingness to let go of control and give herself honestly could rebuild his faith. The story reminds me that wealth, status, and appearances are all fragile shells. What lasts is character. The way Dan clung to honesty even when it left him broke. The way Avery sought truth even when it meant stepping out of her world of power. Their ending isn't perfect in a fairy tale sense. They will still fight battles against competitors, against fear, against the ordinary struggles of raising a child. But it is exactly this imperfection that makes the ending satisfying. It isn't about a millionaire saving a mechanic. It's about two people from wildly different worlds saving each other.